This is a brand of interface that I have never heard of before. Depushing? And it's either called the USB audio interface or professional sound card. Catchy. This thing is so cheap they couldn't even afford a name. In fact, this thing came from Temu, a website that's notorious for selling, well, crap. This costs just over 72 Canadian dollars or 50 US dollars. And if you would believe it, it was on sale from $200 of a regular price. But no, it wasn't. It never will be. Whether or not I can recommend this thing in the end, though, there's a lot of questions that come up with something like this. We're going to get to those questions in a bit. But first, let's get the basics out of the way. Just so you know, the setup here, pretty simple. I have my NTG3 going directly into the Depushing interface, and nothing's being applied in post except for a bit of gain. And you can see behind me the WAV files recording on my PC. You can tell I'm not going to need a lot of gain. Now, this thing actually is a pretty decent build. It's all metal construction, knobs and connectors feel good, nothing really out of place. You have 4 inputs on the front with all high Z and low cut on them. Mono, loopback, and FX switches on the front. Now, one oddity here is that FX, which is basically controlled by the knob just above it. Well, it's just a weird delay, which I'm guessing is for the guitar DI input. And lastly, on the front, you have dual headphone outs, which is a really nice touch. By the way, those headphone outs are actually pretty clean, all things considered. Flipping it around, you're going to notice this thing has options for power, either hub powered or wall power, which is actually kind of cool. Kind of weird that it's USB-B. I mean, 2005 called, they want their printer cable back. Oh, come on, that was fun. No? All right. There's an accompaniment input, which is kind of weird to call it that, but I mean, cool. Line outputs next and monitor outs beside them. Interesting quirk here though. The monitor outs just don't work on this thing, but the line out does. Kind of weird. And you also have your 48 volt switches for 1 and 2, as well as 3 and 4. Now here's where the bad news does kind of start to leak in. This thing is woefully lacking in specs. Like, none, other than one, and you can see it here on the box. The eagle-eyed among you may have noticed it says 24-bit and 192 kilohertz. It also says that on the interface itself. And if that's true, that is impressive. In fact, that's how I came to hear about this. Dylan called me and said, dude, if this thing does 192 kilohertz at this price point, that's cool. So then with a claim like that, I had Dylan take a sample to test and verify. And well, these were his findings. Now you have to follow this closely, but I'll sum it up in the end, but stay with me. When you look at the spectrograph in Audition, you can see a sharp roll-off at around 48K. Now, following Nyquist's law, that tells us that the analog to digital converters are actually converting at 96K, as this 48 kilohertz roll-off is the pre-filter before the conversion stage. So then what is it doing with all those extra samples? I mean, it's definitely recording 192 kilohertz audio files, but we can see we're not getting 192 kilohertz worth of conversion. On the spectrograph, it just looks like there's nothing there. If you gain up the audio extremely high, you can see small areas of activity that follow the peaks of the converted signal below 48K. They're the dark blue lines at the top of this spectrograph. That tells us that the audio coming in from the converter is 96 kilohertz, and either the interface or the driver is upsampling the audio to 192 kilohertz. For example, in this native 192 kilohertz recording, there's no roll-off and the noise and signal occupy the entire audio spectrum recorded from 20 Hz to 96 kilohertz, which is the highest frequency that can be reproduced at 192 kilohertz. Now, if all of that is over your head, let me put it this way. This is absolute BS. What confuses me here, though, is even if they sold it as a 96 kilohertz sample rate, they would have been equally as impressive at this price point. I don't really get it. One thing I should point out, though, which isn't officially listed, but it is important, this thing does not have any drivers or anything to be installed. There's no ASIO for multi-track recording, meaning you're just recording a stereo file out of this left and right. And lastly, well, it only works in Windows, which explains why I'm sitting here at my desk in front of my PC. I'm not exactly sure why, but Macs just don't even recognize it being plugged in. And other than that, there's no other specs to be included, which makes these next tests even more mind-blowing. So up until now, I've been using an NTG3, and that's pretty decent. You don't need a bunch of gain to use it. However, it doesn't really allow you to test out the mysterious gain range and noise level of the preamps. So we have this, the SM7B, probably the best microphone to test this out with. And boy, oh boy, do I have something to show you. These are the levels that I'm recording at. You can actually see it behind me, and I'll put the screen cap up here. That's pretty impressive. Okay, this is the point that I gain it up to 100 to test that noise on the preamps. But here's the gotcha. This is already at 100% on the gain dial. Now let me go quiet to let that sink in. Now, yes, you can get higher gain from other interfaces, like, I don't know, the Connect 6 from Lewitt. But they don't sound like this when you max them out. Once again, though, this thing was bought for 72 Canadian dollars, which translates to $50 US. That's just downright insane, which leads us to discussing those questions I brought up in the beginning. I think the first question that should be on everybody's mind right now is how? For example, in a world where Zoom exists with their high-end noisy preamps, how are we willing to just accept that? The very existence of this means good clean gain is no longer a mid-tier perk, which just reinforces my complaints against companies that have been cutting corners for years. Zoom updating their H-series lineup after 10 years with worse specs on the preamps is a perfect example of that. And it just irritates me that companies are still releasing gear that is clearly just overlooking performance for the sake of financial gain. This thing has no right to be this good for this price. I know this is just a case of the preamps not being pushed to their limit. Basically, it just stops you from pushing it to 11.
Well, it's one louder, isn't it?
But judging by the output while using the SM7B, I'm guessing this thing has about north of 75 dB, and about 10 dB of that is locked. Now, the next question is does this mean we should be expecting more out of certain companies to bring up the entry level for gear? Yes, it does. Next question, does this mean we should hold companies accountable for quality when reaching for our pocketbook? Yes, it does. But the biggest question here, though, whether or not I can even recommend this is, does this set the benchmark for quality for every interface beyond this price point? Yes, it does. Because the existence of this implies that there are some companies out there intentionally dragging their feet at quality. But all of that said, all of that behind us, would I actually recommend that you buy this thing? Sadly, this is where I have to backtrack a bit on all that glowing stuff I just said about the Depusheng USB audio interface. I mean, sure, if you're looking for a super cheap solution for an interface and you don't need decent drivers or you're not on the Mac platform, why not? Keep in mind, though, the quality control here is really suspect. My monitor outs just don't work. My phantom power isn't as clean as I would like it to be, despite all the sounds around me like my PC. I can also hear a bit of static in the system when the phantom power is on. Now, that makes me very nervous using anything with phantom power, especially an expensive mic like this, the NTG3. So, perhaps this is a bit of a crapshoot when it comes to what the conditions yours might come in. I mean, sure, you can just send it back. However long that's going to take, considering this took a month for it to show up. So yeah, I'm not going to go all the way to say don't buy it, but I will say tread very carefully if you're going to drop your money on this, even if it's only $50. Make sure that all your needs are going to be addressed with this thing. For many, I think the lack of multi-track support will be the deal breaker despite being able to use things like ASIO for all. Despite all that, though, this thing is kind of exciting to think that the super entry options are getting so much better, and that should only push the quality up for everything in front of it. Or at least we hope. Fingers are crossed. Cheers, guys, and thanks for watching.